Hi, it's Lee from coloringqueen.net, and I hope you're all doing really well today. Today I am colouring in my Colortronic colouring book. It's a colour by number, and I have had the worst time colouring this week. This is, I think, the 10th picture I have started for my weekly colour and chat with you guys, and every other picture there has been some issue with it. My light fell over on one of them and sort of ruined it. Millie ruined one. Um, I can't really blame her though, because I'd already ruined it before. You know, when you just everything you work on, I don't know if this happens to you, but you're just not feeling it and you're not getting the vibe. So I have now so many pictures in so many different books that are just like half done or a little bit done, and I've gone, no, that's all wrong, it's not going to work, and I've disregarded them. So, you know, I've had to resort to using a colour by number book just to try and get my focus back. And of course, I didn't have all the markers and colours, that you need for the picture. So it's just, one of those days, I guess. But I hope your day is better. So today I've got a story for you from out of Holland, and it's a crime. But it's a pretty long story, so you might need a coffee. I've got one, so you might hear me having a slurp on it because it's just been one of those days. So today's story is about Han van Meegeren, I'm not sure. He was born on the 10th of October 1989 in the Netherlands. And his mother and father, his father was a history and French teacher. They had 5 children. Han was their third child. And he really did not get on well with his father. He was a sort of creative type, interested in art, and he spent all his spare time painting. And his father opposed this and even punished him by forcing him to write out hundreds of times, I know nothing, I am nothing, I'm capable of nothing. So I think we've all heard of parents like this. So yeah, they did not get along. And it wasn't until he was in high school that he became encouraged in his painting by one of his teachers, whose name was Bartus, and he became a bit of a mentor for young Han. And the mentor was a real fan of the art painted by Johann Vermeer, and he shared that love with Han, and he even showed him how to mix paints just like Vermeer did. And Han would continue for the rest of his life to love the works of Vermeer throughout his life. Maybe a little bit too much. But when it came to choose his career, naturally Han's father opposed art as a career, but he encouraged him to study architecture, which he did. And I guess this was his way of using his creativity to draw buildings and earn an income. And this was all pre-computers, obviously, in, I think I said 1989 in the beginning. I mean 1889. Oh God, it is one of those days. Anyway, this was all pre-computers, so all of those renders and drawings, they had to actually be drawn by hand, and people use pencils, just like we do in our colouring books, to colour it in and do the artist impressions back in the day. He ended up studying at Delft Technical College, which was actually the hometown of his idol Vermeer. So, and he had that in common with his favourite artist. And as well as those architecture classes, he also took painting and drawing classes. But many of these he excelled in, and while he was studying, he actually took on architectural jobs. He actually designed the clubhouse for the rowing club in Delft, which still stands today, and it's considered to be a beautiful building. And he did well in his course, but he actually refused to take the final exams as he didn't want a career in architecture. He'd always said he wanted to be a painter. But he won the prestigious gold medal from the Technical University for his study of a church. But that wasn't enough to sway him to stick to it. And that medal was only given out every 5 years. So it was a real honour to receive it. But he still said, no, architecture is not for me. Anyway, he was doing well in his course, and he actually met his first wife there, and they were married when she was pregnant with their first child. And a year later, in 1913, he'd given up the architecture course and he'd actually started studying art at The Hague. So he was actually getting where he wanted to be and ignoring what his parents wanted and just travelling his own path. But as he had a family to feed, he knew that he needed to earn an income. And so he took a further course at the Royal Academy of Art at The Hague. And once he completed that course, he was able to teach art. And he got a job as an assistant to a professor at art and drawing. But even then, the monthly pay wasn't enough because now he had 2 children and a wife to support. So he actually started selling some small art pieces like Christmas cards and small portraits and the like. And these are really highly collectible today. Anyway, he eventually had enough work to have a gallery show, and that was super well received as well. And he eventually became quite well known and popular throughout not only the Netherlands but also Europe. And he also developed a following of English and American fans who loved his paintings of deer and the style of painting he had that was very much influenced by 17th century Dutch masters. And I mean, back in those days, it was much harder to be world renowned because we didn't have, Facebook and Insta and things like that. That was back in the day of people actually traveling physically to see things, so a lot more difficult to become renowned in other countries. Anyway, Han and Anna ended up divorcing, and I think you sort of guessed that when I said she was his first wife. And she took the kids to Paris with her to live, and that sounds pretty nice. But Han travelled intermittently to Paris to see his children. But in the meantime, he not only threw himself into work, but also his new relationship with an actor or actress, Joanna, and they ended up living together with her daughter that she had from her previous relationship. And it was here that Han started to feel the pinch. He really needed to earn a few more extra bucks. And I think we've all been in that situation. And by the 1920s, his paintings were so very similar to the old masters that many felt that he was actually copying them, and his style started to lose some of its sparkle because people believed he didn't actually have any original work and his only talent was to copy the style of others, particularly old Dutch masters. And he really didn't accept this criticism lightly, and instead he doubled down by fighting back in a series of articles that he published in his own magazine. And the content of the articles I'm not going to repeat here because they're really not very politically correct to put in this video, but he basically called people a lot of names and had a lot of nasty stuff to say about different people. And this was in the 1930s in Europe. So I'm going to leave it to your imagination to think about what that nasty stuff is that I'm not going to repeat. Anyway, so he really was very critical of if people said that his style was a bit similar to Dutch masters. He basically said really nasty things about them personally and also their taste in the artwork that they admired, like Cubism. But he still continued with his normal portraits and paintings after he'd had his little vent. But he decided that he would show the art world just how good he was at copying the old master's style. And it would be this artwork that would see him go down in history. as being able to perpetrate an amazing art con. So he and his wife, Jo, they moved to the south of France, and it was here that he devoted the next 5 years to perfecting forgeries of the great masters. He studied the biographies of the old masters, their techniques, and anything that would help him create the perfect forgery. And he initially forged works by Franz Hals, Peter de Hurch, Gerard Bosch, and Johann Vermeer. And Vermeer had always been a favourite of Hans, and there was not a lot of his artwork in existence, and it's no surprise that it would be the forgery that would be his masterpiece. So there was an article in 1932 on Vermeer which had also brought a lot of attention to Vermeer, and two of his paintings had actually been found, but one was proven to be a fake by art expert Dr. Abraham Brediers. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Anyway, finally Hahn thought that he would choose to forge a painting by Vermeer as his masterpiece. And Vermeer hadn't been particularly well known until the beginning of the 20th century, and his works were both extremely valuable and scarce, as only about 35 had survived. Now, I think it might be about now that Hahn decided that he would do a forged Vermeer, and he made it his mission to fool Dr. Abraham Bredius as the art expert. And about this time, he moved into a new home in a small village of France with his wife, and he spent the next few years practicing through trial and error. And we know what that's like just with colouring. Imagine trying to do it to forge a painting. Anyway, he really spent a lot of time on this, like years, working out the correct techniques to forge a Vermeer, but also getting the correct paint and canvas compositions. And according to Wikipedia, he actually bought authentic 17th century canvases, and he mixed his own paints from raw materials using the old formulas so that they could actually pass authenticity tests. And he even created his own paintbrushes from badger hair that Vermeer was said to have used to ensure that those brushstrokes looked authentic as well. And he also came up with a way to age the paints so that they actually looked like the work was 300 years old. And he'd mix up the paints with lilac oil to stop the colours fading or yellowing. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have never seen lilac oil. So I don't know if it's just something that you get in Europe, but I have never seen it in the shops, and I buy a lot of essential oils myself. I've always got lemon going in the office, but I've never heard of lilac oil, so I don't know if this is something from the old days that people used all the time and it's just not known anymore, or if it's like rose oil and it's super expensive. But if you've heard of lilac oil, I would love to know more about it because I'm fascinated now. I'm committed to this story. So apparently the smell of the lilacs was so strong from using the oil in his studio that he actually put a vase of lilacs in his studio to detract, so that people would think that the smell emanated from the flowers and not the oil that he was using. So, and then he would bake the painting, I just assume in a normal oven, not like a kiln or anything like that. And then he'd roll a tube over it to increase the aged or cracked look. And after that, he'd mix up a wash of India ink and he'd basically fill in the cracks and sort of make it look a little bit dirty, I guess, just to give it that really aged look. So a lot of trouble and a lot of trial and error to get to this position. So he then started painting Vermeer's style by creating a few paintings that were very similar to ones that Vermeer had already painted, and also the type of things that Vermeer had already painted. And Millie is trying to get some attention from me, so I'm losing my train of thought here. Anyway, so he purchased an old, sort of mediocre Dutch painting from the 17th century so that he would have an authentic canvas for his recreations, if you like. And then he created all the paints that he would need to create this Vermeer masterpiece, because he really just wanted to stick it to everyone that he was as good as every painter of the day, and he wanted to fool them, basically. So he started off by painting a few typical Vermeer type scenes of interiors, for which Vermeer was pretty well known. And then he had a sort of stroke of genius. Instead of forging variations of the interiors, which could be compared to works hanging in museums, Hahn decided to forge an early Vermeer of a religious theme based on a composition. And scholars or artistic historians had long suspected that Vermeer had been to Italy, and Hahn's lost painting that he is banging up in his studio, a nice little forgery, would have confirmed this sort of Italian connection. And so the subject and the early technique of the painting also would help to mask his own inadequacies at copying Vermeer. It would be put down to the time that Vermeer studied in Italy, and he would bring an Italian sense to it by using a version of Michelangelo's Supper at Emmaus. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Located in Italy, and then that would sort of confirm to art historians that yes, Vermeer had been in Italy, and this forgery that Hahn was doing was representative of the time that he was there, and he was a younger artist then, and that would offset any discrepancies in the technique, and it would give it historic credibility when it was later sort of, quote, discovered. His problem though was because he was forging the paintings and it had to be secret, he had no models to sit for him as most painters did. So he had to be either inspired by other painting or other people that Vermeer had painted, like Girl with the Pearl Earring, and sort of change them up to suit his portraits, or use his imagination. So the painting ended up being named Christ and the Disciples of Emmaus, and it had pictures in it of people that were actually in Vermeer's other paintings if you look at them, and you can see where he got his inspiration from, and he sort of changed it up a little bit. So he then gave it to a friend of his, a lawyer called C.A. Boone, and he told him that it was a Vermeer, and he asked him to show it to Dr. Adrian Bredius, that art expert. He was the one that had already discovered a fake Vermeer. And so Boone approached Dr. Bredius and told him that he was acting as trustee for a large estate of Dutch paintings. And Dr. Bredius was no ordinary art expert. He was in his 80s at the time, but he was considered to be the bee's knees as far as old Dutch masters' paintings were concerned. And he examined the painting and he said, it's an original, and that it was a masterpiece. Not only did he say that, he actually put it in an article which was considered to be the premium art magazine of the time, and he gushed that it was a wonderful moment in the life of a lover of art when he finds himself suddenly confronted with a hitherto unknown painting by a great master, untouched on the original canvas and without any restoration, just as it left the painter's studio. And what a picture. But he also noted that the picture was quite different from other Vermeers, yet every inch of Vermeer. So, like, it had the soul of a Vermeer. Anyway, the chemical analysis and x rays of the picture that they did back in the day all passed muster, and the painting was declared to be a genuine Vermeer. Now, I am sure that Han was sitting there rubbing his hands in glee by now, because he'd basically fooled the experts, the one that had even proclaimed a fake Vermeer previously. So the painting was then sold to the Rembrandt Society for what would now be the equivalent to nearly £4.7 million, and it was donated to a museum in Rotterdam. And it was the centrepiece for an exhibition in honour of Queen Wilhelmina's Jubilee at the museum. And Han was he was loving it. He was totally cashed up, and so he moved to Nice and he bought a 12-bedroom estate, and he bought paintings, and he also hung some of his best forgeries up there, as well as some original old masters. But the problem is, everyone's talking about this painting, but Han's not getting the credit for it. He also set to work to create a few more Vermeers, but about this time, you would think that you were quit when you were ahead, to be honest, but anyway, he didn't. And about this time, World War II was about to start, so he toddled back to the Netherlands and continued to create a number of forgeries. But he was worried about keeping money at this time due to the war. So he basically had a Clayton's divorce with his wife. Basically, he transferred all his assets to her and they divorced, but they were actually still together and still living together. It was just basically for taxation reasons. So, and to ensure that, it wasn't confiscated. So his work, though, was now starting to decline, and he was starting to get a bit old, and his partying lifestyle was starting to cause his health to deteriorate. He drank a lot, he smoked a lot, and he actually became addicted to sleeping pills. And during this time, the Netherlands was actually subject to German occupation. So, an art dealer at this time sold one of his forgeries of a Vermeer, it's called Christ with the Adulteress, to a Nazi banker and art dealer called Aloysius Miedel. And the painting, though, wasn't properly authenticated because of war times. They couldn't compare it to anything because most of those pieces in museums were locked away to protect them from war. So it didn't have quite the checks that it should have had. Now, this painting was then sold by the art dealer to Hermann Göring, who traded 137 to 200 paintings that he had stolen for it. And he just tucked it away with other art pieces that he'd stolen, estimated to be over 6,700. And he put them in a salt mine in Austria. And there the painting sat with all these other beautiful artworks that had been looted during the war. So by 1943, Han's forgeries had earned him the equivalent nowadays of US 25 to $30 million. And he certainly made the most of that money. It funded a pretty good lifestyle where he purchased property, more art, jewellery, and in a 1946 interview, he boasted that he owned 52 houses, 15 country houses, as well as all these beautiful artworks hanging on the walls, most of which were originals and, of course, some of his good forgeries. Now, who says crime doesn't pay? But then the war ended, and the art dealer told the Allies about the Vermeer that he'd sold to Göring. And they managed to trace the transaction back from the art dealer to the lawyer that was acting as trustee for Han. And so in May of 1945, Han was arrested and he was charged with aiding and abetting the enemy. Now, during this time, this was punishable by death. So he was popped into prison for a couple of weeks until he came up with his defence. Now, during this, in order to demonstrate his case, his defense was that he hadn't aided and abetted because they were actually forgeries. And he actually came up with this demonstration of that. Under police guard in the court, he'd paint another fake Vermeer, which was called Jesus Among the Doctors, and he used the materials and techniques that he'd used for the other forgeries. Now, this trial went on for 2 years, and Hahn claimed that he turned to this life of forgery because he was disappointed because he hadn't received any credit or acknowledgement from other artists and critics about how good he was as a painter. And so anyway, he painted this piece of artwork in the court, under police guard, copying in the Vermeer style again. So he was released from prison in 1946, and the actual trial started in October of that year. And he ran with the defence that the painting that Goring had bought was not a genuine Vermeer, but something that he'd knocked up himself. And he added that he had traded the painting for 200 Dutch paintings that Goering had looted during the war. And so because he got those 200 paintings back into Dutch hands, he actually should be considered a hero rather than a Nazi collaborator, which is basically what he was being charged with. And he maintained throughout the trial that, he can't be accused of collaboration because the painting was a forgery, and he'd actually demonstrated that. He also said that his wife knew nothing about his illegal activities, wasn't associated in his crimes in any way, and that he acted alone. And for some reason, he also felt it necessary to tell them that he'd painted another 5 Vermeers, another 2 Peter de Hooches, and they had been actually on the art market for the last 10 years. So while the authenticity of the painting that Goring had bought, or lack thereof, was verified, he remained in prison, and all sorts of experts were compiled into a panel to determine whether the painting was a forgery or not. And the pigments, the chemical composition of the paintings, and the style was all analysed, and of course it was found to be a forgery. The real kicker for Hahn was the hardeners that he'd used. He'd used bakelite, and that hadn't been invented until the 20th century, and so obviously it could not be a Vermeer. So as the painting was not original, it wasn't the cultural property of the Netherlands, and the collaboration charges had to be dropped. They still went ahead though with charges of fraud and forgery, and the prosecution wanted 2 years in prison, but the court ended up only sentencing him to 1 year in prison. And he was pretty tickled pink about this, to get only 1 year in prison. And he told reporters at the time he'd actually looked up the laws 12 years earlier before he started his forgery to make sure what the sentences were if he was found guilty of forgery. So I certainly thought ahead about it. And he said that he also told the reporters that he produced them not for the money but for the art's sake. Seems a bit weird because he certainly went through the money. But anyway, he said that he was just pretty disenchanted and that no one knew who he was, and people sort of wrote him off as a mediocre artist, and he just wanted to prove them all wrong. And he sort of compared himself to Picasso because he made way more money than he did during that time by pretending to be somebody else. So, and he managed to keep it quite secret. Not many people knew, and he continued to say that his wife didn't know. But anyway, before he was sentenced to that year in prison, he was allowed to return home which seems weird to me, but he spent a month at home. He was free to do what he wanted. He wasn't under house arrest or anything like that. And in the Netherlands, they actually ran an opinion poll, and his popularity was actually second in the nation, just behind the prime ministers and ahead of the royalty. So Dutch people thought that, yes, he was a con man and he'd fooled the Dutch art world, but more importantly, he'd fooled Hermann Goering. So he could have appealed this sentence, and he had a month to do that. But on the very last day he could file for appeal, he actually had a heart attack. He was hospitalised, and while he was in hospital, he ended up having another heart attack, which would end his life on 30th of December 1947. So he was only 58 when he passed away. But the legal proceedings still continued on without him. He had amassed a huge amount of money in his lifetime from selling these paintings, and the court ruled that the estate property should be auctioned off and the money returned to people who believed they'd purchased a genuine painting for him. And also, he hadn't paid income tax on the sale of those paintings, so the government wanted their little cut on that as well. So all up, his property was sold, and it fetched the equivalent of US 500,000 in today's money. But remember, that wasn't all of his property, because he went through that divorce, and they were still living together with his wife, and she couldn't be charged. The court ruled that she wasn't an accomplice in Hans' forgeries, and so she got to keep the lot, all the money, and it was estimated to be worth about 50 million US dollars in today's money. And Jo lived quite happily on this nest egg until she was about 91. The controversy, though, didn't stop there. Despite the expert evidence and the confession of Hahn, there were still some people that believed the paintings were genuine and that the experts were actually wrong. And one man even sued the art expert on the panel, as he'd purchased a Vermeer and felt that the analysis of the forgeries devalued his painting. This litigation fell flat, though, because an x-ray of the painting actually revealed the painting underneath that he'd painted over, and they were even able to trace back that purchase of the painting to Hahn. So it seems though the fake Vermeers went far and wide. In the late 60s, the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, they examined their Vermeers, and they found that several of the paintings used materials invented in the 20th century. In this case, it wasn't the Bakelite hardener, but it was white lead that was purchased. And during Vermeer's time, this product was mined in Low Countries, but by the 19th century, it was imported from Australia and the US, and it actually had a different composition and different elements, and so it could easily be distinguished from the white lead that Vermeer used. So Hahn remained in the public long after his death, as over the years there have been a number of investigations of other Vermeers. He was highlighted on programs like Scams, Schemes and Scoundrels and Fake or Fortune. And in 2008, Harvard-trained art historian Jonathan Lopez published a book about him. It's called The Man Who Made Vermeers, Unvarnishing the Legend of Master Forger Han van Meegeren. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. And it was his opinion that Hahn started his career of forgery not because he felt misunderstood and undervalued by art critics, but for the income that it generated, an income which he needed to support his addictions and promiscuity. But Hahn's work remained popular after his outing as a forger, and he was even offered a number of commissions and offered to go to the US and paint for a gallery in Manhattan, and sales of his previous artwork increased in value. So all those things that he used to knock up in his spare time and when he was younger, this work is now recognised as very valuable and recognisable, and people actually started copying him. But for Hahn, they were even doing that during his lifetime, and he felt that the forged copies of his work were not of a very high standard. So he was critical of his forged copies. I think that's hilarious. But it wasn't just strangers copying Han, it was also his own son, Jacques. The paintings were said to be of a low quality by Jacques, but he was very good at doing the signature. I'd be curious to know what you think of this case. Like, did he do it for the money, as suggested in the book, or because he wanted the attention? And do you think his wife knew what he was up to? I think she did. I think she did. Come on. But I'd love to know what you think. So that's it from me. And obviously, there's a lot more to Han's life. I could only do a small amount in the time that we've got today, but it is very interesting to read up on and have a look around. There's heaps more out there on him. I'd be interested in what you guys think, but I think, he was really playing with fire doing that. But anyway, each to their own. But I'd love to know what you guys think. And that's it from me. And hopefully I'll get my colouring mojo back by next week. And I'll actually be able to do a picture that is, for something for my colour along. I don't know what it will be. We'll see. I just hope I get my mojo back. And that's it from me until next week, or until next time. Stay safe out there.